Okay, so now we've got our 3D scene completed. How are we going to make a picture of this so we can share it with people on Facebook and let them know how amazing we are? Well, this is where we need to look at how to render and composite an image. So if you're rendering an animation, you would come across to the render output here and you'd set up all the different options like where you want to send it to, how many frames you want to render, what format you're going to render in, etc. Now, when you're rendering a still image, you don't need to do any of this. What you do instead, and I'd always recommend that when you do a render, you do it in the compositing workspace. So I go to the compositing workspace and I'm going to turn on use nodes. This is going to create a render layers node. So this is what's going to be output by the render engine. And this is the composite node. And this is what's going to be saved into the output file. But before we render, we need to set up the render properties. So over here in the right hand side, in the properties panel, we've got the render options at the top where we set the render engine and where we also set, very importantly, the number of samples we use. So the number of samples dictates the quality of the final result. The more samples, the better. But you can have too many, and then it's going to take a long time to render unnecessarily. Or you can use automatic rendering samples, which will basically say when the image is this, or when an individual pixel is of this quality, then stop rendering it. If it's a high enough quality, the pixel doesn't have much noise, then stop rendering that pixel so no more samples are used on that pixel. So in that case, you just set a minimum number of samples and a maximum number of samples. So if you turn noise threshold off, then it's just going to use a set number of samples, and each pixel is going to use the same number of samples regardless of whether it still needs it. So it's always better to turn on noise threshold and then let this decide when to stop sampling so that you image renders in the fastest possible time whilst retaining the desired quality as indicated by the noise threshold. And in order to find the best settings for the samples, we'll go back to the layout and we'll first experiment with these render settings for the viewport. So we've got viewport, sample settings, and we've got the final render sample settings as well. So I'm just going to use these ones to find the ones that I want. So I press T to hide that. I'm going to make sure I turn on overlay so I can see the number of samples in the top left-hand corner. I'll make sure I deselect everything so I don't get any yellow lines. And what I'm looking for is the noisiest part of the image. And I want to find out how many samples it takes to get that noisy part of the image to look good. So I'm going to turn off noise threshold. I'm just going to watch the number of samples in the top left-hand corner. I want to make sure that this noisiest part underneath here, as soon as this becomes acceptable, I want to look up to the top left and see what number of samples I'm on. And that's going to be the maximum samples I need to use. So around about there, I would say 726 is fine. So I can set the maximum samples now. If we turn on noise threshold again to, let's go 750. Minimum samples I want to set to something like maybe 16. You don't want to go too low with that, because if you go too low, then the noise threshold can make a mistake and think a pixel is already clean enough, even if it's still noisy. So it's a good idea to not set that to 0, for example. And then because we've got the maximum samples required, we can now control the quality of the image by the noise threshold alone. So 0.1 is giving us this result here, which we can see is still noisy. And I'm just going to isolate this noisy part now. So Control B, and I'll draw a render region so that we're only rendering a very small area of the image so that it renders much faster. Just so we can, reach the quality we want without having to wait for the entire image to keep re-rendering. So I'll change this to 0.05, and now we'll look at the quality afterwards. Still not very good. 0.01. So this is much better quality now, and it's still going up. And if it goes to the full 750, which it has done, then that's the maximum quality we're able to get, unless we increase the max samples even further. So that's actually fine. Now, most modern denoisers, such as cycles, have also got a denoising option, and this means you can actually use a much higher noise threshold so that you're left with a noisy image. So if I change this to 0.1, for example, again, it's going to finish very noisy, but we can use the denoiser now to clean that up. So let's go for the denoiser. I'll turn that on. And although it's cleaned it up, we can see we've lost a lot of detail. It's very smooth now. This is probably because we've not got very good denoiser settings set up. For the best quality, I'm going to choose Open Image Denoiser. I'm going to make sure that I use the albedo and the normal to help with the denoising process. And I'm going to make sure the filter is set to accurate, because these are the settings I'm going to be using in the final render. So these are the ones I want to use in the viewport as well. So that was not bad. I would say we're losing a bit of detail in the top of the monster's head. So I'll go with 0.05. And you'll notice it is going quite slow now because of the denoiser. So in the viewport, what we can do is say don't start using the denoiser until we get to a specific number of samples. So I'm going to go with 300 samples. And it'll start rendering again. It's very fast to 300. And then we're still getting the blurriness. So I'm just going to keep watching now. And it did actually take the full amount of samples until that top part became acceptable. Okay, so I'm happy with those settings now. If you don't want to do all this work yourself, you can use Turbo Render, which will do it automatically. This is an add-on that is available from my Gumroad or from the Blender Market. It's not free, but it will automate all that work for you, and it will generally give you much faster renders as well, usually around 3 to 5 times faster. But I'm not going to do that in this video. Obviously, you might not have the add-on. So I'm going to set the samples now over here to match the final render samples to match the viewport samples. So 0.05, maximum samples 750, min samples 16. Now, I'm not going to set a time limit. I want it to go all the way until it reaches the quality I've specified here. And then for the denoiser, I want to make sure I'm using the same settings here as well, which I am. And then finally, I need to make sure I render the full image. So I'll go into the render output and I'll just turn off render region and I'll specify the size I want. So 1920 by 1080 is fine. And again, these settings are unimportant until we render an animation. So don't worry about these. We'll go across to the compositor. And I want to, before I start rendering, change this to be an image editor. And I'll set it to render result. This will allow us to watch the render as it happens. And in order to get Blender to use this window, what we'll need to do is go into Edit, under Preferences, go to the Interface options at the top, and under Temporary Editors, we can change this to render in Keep User Interface. That will make sure it uses whichever image editor you've got open. The default is New Window, which is going to cause a pop-up window to be used instead. So it's up to you, but my preference is always to keep the user interface. It just keeps things a little bit more tidy. And then to render the still image, you press F12, or to render an animation, you use Control F12. Obviously, I'm rendering a still image, so F12, or in my case, because I've got Turbo Tools installed, it's Alt F12 to avoid rendering with Turbo Render. And now we're going to start seeing the scene start to render. And we notice we've actually got a rogue element that we didn't want to appear in the render. And this is because if I just go across back over here and just let it finish rendering, it's nearly finished. We'll go back to the layout. You'll notice in here we've got an object which has got it's been disabled in the viewport, but it's been left enabled in the final render, as indicated by this icon here. So if I turn the eyeball back on, we can see it in the viewport as well. So if ever this happens, it's virtually always because you've done that. So you can turn them both off and it won't appear in the final render, or I don't need it anyway, so I'm just going to delete it. I'll go back to the compositor and then I'll render the still image again. And there we go. So it's finished rendering in 19 seconds. Not bad, but not amazing, obviously, but not bad. And I'm going to make this full screen by hovering the mouse over this editor, pressing Control Spacebar, and we can zoom in and start looking at the image. Now this looks great, everything looks good, the reflections are matching the actual reflections in the scene, and we've got shadows, and yeah, it's a good quality final render. Now, the problem comes if we've got something in the scene where it's a very bright object, we're not going to get coloured reflections. And I'm going to show you that now. So we go back to the layout, and I'm going to add something very bright. So Shift A, we'll add a monkey. I'll just move it across a bit. I'll rotate it on the x-axis by, let's say, 45 degrees. And move it up a bit. Let's just come out of camera view and make sure it's aligned with the floor correctly. About there, rotate it around a bit. So about there should do fine. I'm going to make it smooth by giving it a subdivision modifier, Control 3 to do that. We'll apply that subdivision modifier, Control A over here. We'll give it a new material, and I'll make it something very bright, like a bright green. Make it a bit glossy, and I'll turn on Shade Smooth as well. Back into camera view, let's have a quick look. Yeah, and I'm going to render this again now. So into the compositing, I'll do Alt F12 in my case, or just F12 in your case. We'll give it a second to render. And we can see it's very noticeable now that this bright green object is only getting black reflections. So to fix this, what we can actually do is render some additional information. So let's go down to the View Layer properties, and this is where we can tell the Render Layers node which data we want to be able to use after we've rendered. And because we're using a shadow catcher object, it's a good idea to enable the shadow catcher pass. And now you can see this appears on the render layers node so that we can use this after we've rendered. So let's try rendering again. Alt F12 in my case, F12 in yours. And you'll notice the problem now, we've lost the environment behind the shadow catcher. And that's because we've enabled the shadow catcher pass. So I'm going to cancel that render by pressing Escape, and I'm going to turn on the environment pass as well, so that those missing parts we can add back in. I'll do Alt F12. We'll still get the information missing, but we've now got the information over here so that we can add it back in. Okay, so we'll take this information now, and I want to Shift A, S, and I'm going to put down an alpha over node, and I'm going to connect the image to the front, and then whatever's going to go behind the image, in this case the environment, goes into the top slot. And if we plug this one in now, you can see we've got the environment back. But the problem is we've no longer got shadows or reflections, and that's what the shadow catcher pass is for. So if I now add the shadow catcher information to the image by Shift A, and I'll search for a mix node, I'll set this to be multiply. I'm going to plug this into the top. No change yet because it's just multiplying the input image by white, which is multiplied by 1, so it stays identical. And then I'm going to plug the shadow catcher into the bottom socket. And now you can see we've got the coloured reflections on the floor. It didn't make much difference on the other objects because they're quite dark brown anyway, quite dark colours, so it wasn't obvious that the problem was there. But it's good to know that if you do want coloured reflections in your shadow catcher, that's how you can do it. And that's it. So once you've finished with your render setup and you've got your final render completed, what people normally do to achieve better quality images to share with people is to come into the render properties here, down to the bottom, into colour management, and make sure the view transform is changed to standard. It'll become a little bit less filmic, as you might expect, because it was on filmic before. And make sure exposure is 0, gamma is 1, and look is none. And the reason we use standard instead of filmic or AGX or similar is because those other options, those view transforms, will actually modify the image. So when we're making manual modifications in the compositor, they're going to be making secondary modifications which we've got no control over. So at this point, there are lots of things we can do to improve how realistic and well integrated the 3D geometry is with that HDRI environment. But I want to keep it quite simple for now, so we'll just look at a few of the ways we can get this image looking better. And then towards the end of the course, we'll get much more in depth. So firstly, we'll press N to bring up the image editor's scopes option and change this to parade. And we'll come down a bit. And the aim is, because we're going to create a JPEG or something that's going to be displayed on a device that isn't high dynamic range. We want this all the pixel data to fall within a range of 0 to 100. So 0 at the bottom and then 100 at the top. At the moment, we can see that we've only got pixels very sort of around about the 80 mark, so it's looking quite dim. To brighten this up, Shift-A, and we'll look for an RGB curve node. We'll drop this in, and I'm actually going to create 4 of these. So one for the white level, one for the black level rather, one for the white level, one for the gamma, so that's the mid-range, and one for the contrast. And then what you do is, you set the white level by choosing something in the scene that's white. So I'll hover my mouse over the white level here, press E, and now I've got a little eyedropper. I want to choose something in the scene that I know is white. So it doesn't matter if it's not white exactly because of the lighting, but just that that particular object is white in real life. So I'm going to click on this pillow. You can see that's brightened it up considerably, and it's also removed the color cast that we were getting. So it's too much. We're now going above the 100 line. So I'm going to bring this down now, the top part of this down until all the data falls within that 100 mark. So this part here is just within the 100 mark, not quite, a bit further. There we go. Okay, so we've got the white level set up. We also need to set the black level. But at the moment, all of the pixel data is already at the bottom there. There's nothing going below 0. So we don't really need to worry about the black level. So I'll get rid of this one, Control X. Although actually, I'll show you just in case. If you do have pixels here at the bottom that aren't going all the way to the 0 line, if they're too high, or they're going below the 0 line, then you would use this to set the black level. So I'd hover over the black level, press E, and I'd choose something black in the scene. So maybe, I don't know, maybe this part of the picture over here. It becomes way too black. So what I'll do now is use the bottom end to bring those back up. I don't want to go too far or too low. And I can now use the factor to bring that back down. There we go. So that's a black level set. And now I want to brighten it up without making any of these pixels go above the 100 line. So I use this one to bring the mid-range up until it's nice and bright. And then finally, I might want to add a bit more contrast. So I use this node to bring the darks down a bit and the whites up a bit. And that will add more contrast to the picture to make it pop, whilst making sure that all of the data is still within the 0 to 100 range. Once you're finished with that, the only thing that people sometimes do is add some lens effects. So Shift-A, I'm going to search for lens distortion. We'll drop this down, and then we can add things like chromatic aberration. So let's hide the scopes now. So chromatic aberration, basically it imitates the effect on a camera you get, where towards the edge of the image, the red, green and blue pixels get separated. So let's show you what I mean. I'll turn dispersion up to 0.1. And then you can see we're getting that effect. That's way too strong. So I'll go with something like 0.02, something like that. And it just adds a bit more realism to the render. Although when we've already got a photograph, it may not be the best idea. You may want to limit it just to the 3D geometry and not the HDRI image. But that's something for, that's becoming a little bit more complex for this stage in the tutorial. So I think what we'll do, we'll leave it at 0.02, affect the HDRI and the 3D geometry, and we can also distort the image a little bit as well. So if I set this to 0.1, you see the image becomes distorted like that. And we can change it to fit so that the areas so that we don't see any of the black areas. It will sort of clip the areas it needs to make sure the image still fits the entire picture. Normally I'd go with something like 0.01 or negative 0.1. We'll go in the other direction. I think 0.01 just to give it a slight bit of curvature. And then you've got quite a realistic looking image. And then finally, we want to save this out because it wasn't an animation. It doesn't get saved automatically. So we click on image at the top here and we choose save. And then we save it somewhere we want. So I'll just make it into a JPEG, 100% quality, and I'll call it test render and save the image. And then in our file explorer, we can see we've got the image saved out. So that's the first part of the tutorial. Well done for getting this far, particularly if you're completely new to Blender. There was quite a lot to digest there. So you're doing really well so far. The next part of the tutorial is where we're going to start modeling and animating the robot.